Now, I think that'll be robust, but I also think that'll be wildly inconsistent depending on what's going on in the United States versus wherever else the capital might be. This is still the deepest, most liquid market in the world. It's denominated in the sole source of global store of value. It is the only meaningful method of exchange for international transport and trade. And the Japanese and the Europeans have basically signed on to a US dollar denominated system as part of the deal that generated the sanctions against the Russian central bank a couple of months ago. So if you're going to benefit from this in any way, the US dollar is the place to be, but you can't predict the inflows year on year of what's coming in from the European space or the Asian space. It will come when they're in trouble and we look good, and it will probably never go back. And so we know that the capital supply has to drop domestically, and we know we're going to get these bursts of capital from abroad. But planning on that, that takes a smarter brain than I have.
What happens?
And the millennials themselves will then be entering their late stage worker years. Well, they will gradually become the dominant capital providing class again. So for the United States, we have a pretty big needle to pass through here. And a roughly 10 to 20 years, it can be a little loosey-goosey based on what happens with the monetary system and the Fed in that time. But in that decade of time, the United States will go back to having what we would consider a more stable capital structure. And at the same time, when you get into the 2040s, the labor market will start reconstituting based on normal demographic factors, because the millennials' kids will then be entering the workforce. We'll be through this long winter of the Zoomers. But no one else gets to do that. Everyone else went through industrialization and urbanization either faster or more intensely than the United States did. A couple exceptions, but only a couple. And so for them, they're looking at labor markets getting smaller every year and the capital supply getting smaller every year. And still in this decade, their advanced worker cadre, that big, giant last generation, moves into retirement. So their need for government spending to keep those people alive skyrockets and never drops.
Like, how does that
unfold? We've got some mid and long-term trends, and then there's a couple of really acute ones that are going on right now. Let's first deal with the longer-term ones. Finance doesn't work in China the way it does here. The Chinese will throw a bottomless supply of capital against anything in order to make sure that people have jobs. It doesn't matter if there's a product on the back end, really, as long as the people are working. So everything that people say about the US Fed is actually true to an order of magnitude higher in China. So the US dollar is the global currency. It's the medium of exchange. It's the store of value. It's the lubricant for the #1 economy and 2/3 of the top 20. The yuan is used just in China. It's not internationally traded, and they regularly expand their money supply by 5 times as much as we do. And at most times in the last 10 years, the yuan supply has been twice that of the US dollar, even though it's just not exchanged at all. So their financial system is its own thing. And to think that this is going to continue in perpetuity is being really creative with your math. They get their energy from a continental way. They don't have a navy that's capable of making that far in force in order to secure their own supply lines. So China is the country most dependent upon the US Navy to keep the lights on. In manufacturing, their demographics have aged so much already that China is no longer the low-cost producer for any manufactured product. There is not a product that the Chinese make that cannot be made in North America at a lower price point. Now, you have to build the industrial plant first. So I don't mean to suggest we can flip a switch and it's all here tomorrow. But it does mean that anytime there's a hiccup in the Chinese system for any reason and somebody relocates, they never go back. Because it's better with a shorter supply chain, with less energy, with less transport, with more efficient labor closer to home. There's not a sector where that doesn't work. And then in terms of industrial commodities, kind of an echo of what's going on with energy markets, they have to get it from half a world away. They can't go at it and get it themselves. They are completely dependent upon the globalized system as enforced by the American Navy. So any of these issues by themselves are country killers, independent of the demographic situation. And in the short term, I think we're seeing the whole system go belly up. I think it's safe to assume that most people have relatively formed opinions about whether the COVID vaccine is the way to go or natural immunity is the way to go. But I think if we're all really being honest with ourselves, we will admit that people on the other side of that divide have some relevant points that are worth discussing.
Yeah, sure.
And we certainly know that if you have both, you're in better shape.
Yep.
Neither of those are options in China. The Chinese vaccine doesn't work versus the Omicron variant, certainly not Omicron B. And because, in many ways, that the Chinese government was so successful at keeping COVID out these past 2 years, no one in China has natural immunity. So if they were to open up with Omicron B being the dominant strain, Omicron B is the most communicable virus we've ever faced, and it's the highest lethality rate of all of the COVID variants to date. If they just opened up, they'd have millions of deaths a month for at least 3 months. And in a one-man show government, that is how you bring the system down. So COVID lockdowns that affect entire cities, this is their only option for the foreseeable future. So Shanghai shut down on April 1. They reopened on June 1. They're in the process of locking down again already because Omicron is just so communicable. Masks don't stop it sufficiently because that's all they have left. And now that is leaving very, very quickly. I think Apple's the best example there. Apple is the American company that has ignored the writing on the wall the most. And every time there's been a health issue with COVID or a trade war with Trump or Bernie Sanders coming out and beating the trade drum, every time something has happened, an explosion of genocide in Xinjiang, the crackdowns in Hong Kong, they've ignored it and they've doubled down. So they are the American company most committed to China. Over 90% of the supply chains within China now. And as of last month, even they started looking for alternatives. Everyone is on their way out because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner. Well, I mean, first of all, China does not have many dealings in Africa. They have some infrastructure that they've built.
Yeah, and they're they're doing a lot of loans there.
Well, whenever you see the Chinese spending $12 billion on something that's only worth $3 or $4 billion, that's not investment. That's capital flight. That's some bureaucrat taking advantage of that hyper financialized system to get some out. So when it's his time to run for the door, he already has a nest egg. I'm just saying that it's not in anything that would broadly be considered sound investment.
Okay.
Most of the infrastructure is not in places that are really of any use. I mean, if the Chinese build infrastructure in a place that hasn't had infrastructure for the last 70 years, you really got to ask yourself why there has not been infrastructure there for the last.
Someone would have done it by now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Now they are investing in some resource production zones, absolutely, but again, they're overpaying for them. So the Chinese are doing no refining and they're doing no manufacturing in Africa. So they're actually not taking the African labor force and bringing it up a notch at all. And if they want unskilled labor, they've got that closer to home in a place like, say, Cambodia. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out. Some places can do that, some places can't. But it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent, especially a continent that is riven geographically